Thank you very much, Mr. Yarmouth. This is what you were talking about here, a different way of saying the same thing that you discussed. This is over the period of time from 1979 to 2005. And this is the income growth by each 20% of the population. So those people at the very bottom saw almost no income growth at all. $200. And as you go to the next 20%, the next 20%, you get up to the last 90%. They did okay. They made about $745,000. So that's the 90 to 99% of the population. Those are very, very wealthy people. They did okay. But you go to the top 1%. The top 1%. Excuse me. I'm wrong. That's the top 1/10 of 1%. Not even 1%, 1/10 of 1%. That population saw their wealth increase by nearly $6 million each. And that's what you were talking about, a different way of displaying it. What's happened in the United States is this enormous shift of wealth to the super wealthy. And our Republican colleagues want to reward them for their good success by reducing their tax rate. So much for shared sacrifice. And as Mr. Tonko pointed out, the sacrifice is really the middle class. Because the benefits that the middle class have, the future opportunity for Medicare, they're going to wind up paying more, getting less, as the Republicans terminate Medicare as we know it today. The other part that on taxes, and then I want to turn to one of my favorite subjects, and that how do we get to this deficit? The Republicans want to continue giving $12 to $15 billion of our tax money. This is money that you, I, the stenographer there, the people that work here, the men and women across America that are working, $10 to $12 billion of their tax money, and they want to hand it over to the oil companies. Now, what in the world do the oil companies need a tax break for? They need a subsidy like they don't need it. Why? Because in the last decade, the oil companies, the big oil companies in the United States have earned $947 billion in profits. That's just shy of $1 trillion of profits. And yet our Republicans demand that we give them another $12 billion to $15 billion a year. Now, that's bad enough. But I just came across this fact. ExxonMobil was the most profitable company in the world in 2008. In 2009, ExxonMobil made $19 billion of profit. Well, good for them. And I'm sure they paid their fair share of taxes. Right? Wrong. Their effective tax rate was 0. So since they didn't pay any taxes, we ought to give them another $12 billion to the oil industry. This is just plain wrong. This is not good economic policy. One thing, and then I know you want me to talk about Make It in America, and I will in a few moments, but I get so concerned when people talk about the Democratic deficit. Hello? Not so. Not a Democratic deficit. Really, a Republican deficit. That fellow over there, that's Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan left at the end of his 8 years with a projected $1.4 trillion deficit. $1.4 trillion deficit. Followed by George W. Bush. At the end of the George W. Bush period, the projected deficit going forward would be $3.3 trillion. Thank you, George W. Bush. Between the two of you, you really ran up the deficit. Then along came this fellow Democrat, Bill Clinton. Put in policies voted by Republicans and Democrats, raised the tax rate to what you said, 39% for the super wealthy, and put in place PAYGO. That PAYGO required that any new spending had to be paid for with cuts or new taxes. The result? Bill Clinton left office in 2001 with a projected $5,600,000,000,000 surplus. Then along came George W. Bush, Jr. What did he do? First year in office, a tax cut. You were here, weren't you, Mr. Yarmouth? Trillion.
I'm sorry, I wasn't here when the tax cuts. I didn't have the honor of voting against those.
Okay, so you weren't here. A tax cut year one, tax cut year two, a war, two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, followed by a Medicare drug program that wasn't paid for and the deregulation of Wall Street. The result? He left office with a $11,500,000,000,000 projected deficit going forward. This is where we are. The day Obama came into office, President Obama came into office with a $1,300,000,000,000 deficit the day he took office. And we worked ourselves out of it. Thank goodness the two of you were here to vote for those pieces of legislation. We're working ourselves out of it. That chart that you showed a moment ago shows the growth of the economy. We need to understand that we're not going to get out of this deficit with the kind of cuts that are being discussed by Republicans. It's going to take a balanced approach. President Obama has set out a balanced approach. He said no growth in the discretionary federal budget. He will probably tomorrow talk about how to hold down medical costs, and I gave you some examples a moment ago. Those are the big drivers, and the military. You want to deal with this deficit? End the war in Afghanistan and bring home $120 billion a year. We can do this. Tax policy? Let's let the wealthy pay their share, let the oil companies pay their share. Hold the expenditure steady and reduce it, as has been proposed, and do it in a way that creates economic growth. We can do this. I know you gentlemen on the Budget Committee fought hard for that kind of policy. The Republicans refuse. In fact, their proposal is 30 years before you get the deficit under control, before you eliminate the deficit. We can't have that. I will talk about Make It in America before we're finished here, but I've taken too much time already. I'm going to turn it back to you, Mr. Yarmouth. But I think it's really important for the American public to understand where the deficit came from and how it can be solved over the long run without harming seniors, without taking away Medicare, and by making the critical investments that you've talked about, Mr. Tonko: education, research, Make It in America, those